Fall is my absolute favorite time of year. I'm excited that the weather is cooling off, and I've already started wearing my coziest sweaters. My heather gray Mongolian cashmere sweater from Quince was the first thing I pulled out of my closet as soon as the weather turned cooler. It's soft and warm and so stylish. I wore it all the time last winter and it's still in great shape. $50 is an unbelievable price for a cashmere sweater like this. Quince delivers luxury quality pieces at half the price of similar brands because they cut out the middleman and partner directly with top-tier ethical factories. Layers are the name of the game this time of year. If you need a new winter coat, they have beautiful coats and jackets. They have everything you need for your wardrobe this fall, as well as beautiful linens, bags, and home decor. Pretty much everything you need for your home and wardrobe. Find your fall staples at Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
We live in a post-truth world, and we think now the solution is to check the facts. But just checking the facts is not enough, because even if something you quote is completely true, it could have been overturned by the same authors in a subsequent iteration of the paper, or by a completely independent set of authors in a separate study. So it is really hard to combat misinformation, and this is why I wanted to write about how these things actually matter. Just to get it roughly right is not good enough for some of these high-stakes things that we're talking about, such as health, such as parenting, such as climate change.
That was Alex Edmans on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey, listeners. You know the podcast is values-based work for us and a labor of love. The podcast industry has been a roller coaster ride, and there are some expenses involved in hosting a podcast. We'd love to keep bringing you great episodes, and we could use your support. Help us keep the podcast going next year and beyond. You can do that 2 ways. You can support us on Patreon. For just $5 a month on Patreon, you'll be able to listen to the podcast ad-free. Or show us your love by making a one-time donation in any amount on Buy Me a Coffee. Think of it as taking a co-host out to coffee to thank us for the podcast. You can link to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee accounts on our website. Thanks for your support.
We're spending more than ever. I hate my job.
The price of everything has gone up.
AI is threatening my job.
It's crisis after crisis.
Nothing is working out.
I can't find a job. We're one disaster away.
Take control of change.
I need a change.
Disruption is the force of change. Stop the chaos. Stop the madness. Take control. Read James Patterson's Disrupt Everything and Win.
Wherever you go, whatever they get into, from chill time to everyday adventures, protect your dog from parasites with Credelio Quattro. For full safety information, side effects, and warnings, visit CredeliaQuattroLabel.com. Consult your vet or call 1-888-545-5973. Ask your vet for Credelio Quattro and visit QuattroDog.com.
Support.
This is Yael. I'm here with Emily today to introduce an episode with author Alex Edmans on the topic of his book, May Contain Lies. And I love this book, and I'm so excited to talk about it with Emily because I think it has a lot of implications for the world of information and misinformation that we are living in.
I absolutely loved this conversation. And as I was listening, I was just thinking, if we could all follow Alex's guidance, we could be living in a kinder, gentler world.
One of the things that I wanted to set up before folks listen to this episode is this framework that Alex uses throughout his book of what he calls the ladder of misinference. And it's a way that we sometimes mistake what, quote unquote, is science-backed or data-driven because of the ways that data can be misconstrued in media and in conversation. And so just in brief, what he talks about is that a statement like this is data-backed or there's evidence for this is not a fact. And that a fact is not necessarily data-driven. And that data is not always evidence. And that evidence is not always proof. And so in talking through a lot of these connections that we assume are there, we can start to think that there's proof when it rests on no data or a faulty statement. And this happens sometimes maliciously and sometimes totally unintentionally. And so I think this book and this conversation is so important for the world of information that we're living in so that we can do a better job of synthesizing what's coming in, through our feeds or through our conversations.
Well, and I think being more careful with how we're using all of that quote unquote evidence, which is what I took from it. And I just want to plug, I think everyone should only listen to our podcast, but if they're going to listen to another podcast, I love Maintenance Phase, where they really get into data around health and wellness claims and a lot of the quote unquote grifters, which are bad actors, but also very well-meaning people. And they really get at how data can be misused and evidence over-interpreted. And I think it's a really good application of what Alex and you talk about.
What's so funny, Emily, is that I was going to give a plug for If Books Could Kill, which has a co-host in common from Maintenance Phase. And what I love about this podcast, If Books Could Kill, is not only is it very, very funny, although don't listen to it with kids in the car, there's a lot of profanity. But I also love that what they do is they take to task airport books, books that have become bestsellers that are thought or assumed to be data-backed, evidence-based, and offer really reliable truth. And they pick them apart with science and logic sometimes. And I think it's so important that we have a healthy amount of skepticism.
Yes.
And not that science is entirely reliable, because scientists can make mistakes too, but that we look to science for corrective feedback and recognize that science is an ongoing process and a way of approaching information that has a healthy amount of skepticism embedded in it.
And evolution. So science may give us evidence in one era or in one topic that changes as we learn more. And so a few months ago, I read Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari about information networks from the Stone Age to AI now. And it really demonstrates the power of information and information networks in shaping communities and societies over time. So I think it speaks to all of these sources, including Alex's book and your conversation, really reinforce how critical it is, how we are consuming and sharing information. It really substantially affects our lives.
Thank you, Emily. And I'm so grateful that you're offering some additional resources because I think this is just such an important topic. So we hope that people listen to it, get a lot out of it, and engage in conversation with us around this because it really does need to be an ongoing conversation about how we consume information in our modern world. Enjoy. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Alex Edmans from London Business School. Alex has had quite a journey from Oxford to Wall Street at Morgan Stanley, then MIT for his PhD as a Fulbright scholar, followed by tenure at Wharton before landing at London Business School. He's one of those rare academics who speak both boardroom and classroom, having testified in Parliament, spoken at Davos, and somehow convinced several million people to watch TED Talks. When Alex isn't busy serving as a company advisor doing university teaching or conducting research, he writes books that really and truly matter. His latest, May Contain Lies: How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It, is perfectly timed for our post-truth world where everyone's an expert and every statistic tells a story you want to hear. So I'm really excited he was able to find some time to discuss it with me today. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks so much, Yael. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So I do want to start with a story, and we're going to talk a little bit about the danger of stories, but you begin the book with a picture of you being summoned to testify at the UK House of Commons after some business scandals, and you note that you really can rustle up data to support almost anything. And the sources that we consider reliable are often less trustworthy than meets the eye. But one of the challenges that you note is the obvious solution of checking the facts is more complicated than we realize. And I wonder if you can just begin to introduce this idea of why checking the facts sometimes isn't enough.
Certainly. So let me tell you the story. So in 2016, the UK government launched an inquiry into corporate governance, which is the way that companies are run and overseen. And what you can do is you can submit evidence to the inquiry on issues they were consulting around, such as regulation of CEO pay or board composition. And because I work in corporate governance, I submitted some evidence to that inquiry based on academic research. They invited me to testify to give some oral evidence in front of the House of Commons. Now, I was flattered, but I was also pretty nervous because your testimony is recorded on live TV, it's transcribed. So I got there early so that I could see the temperature of the room and I could swat up on every question they could ask me. But my ears pricked up because I was listening with one ear open to the preceding session. And a witness before me said something that sounded striking, which is that when there's a lower gap between the pay of the CEO and the average worker, firm performance goes up. And this is music to my ears because a lot of my work is on the importance of treating employees well. And so I thought, well, if this evidence was true, then I could cite it myself and even further strengthen the case for ethical treatment of employees. So I looked up the paper, and I could look it up because when they submitted written evidence, you could see the references. But then when I looked at the paper, I found it said completely the opposite of what the witness was claiming, which is that the higher the pay gap, the better the performance, not the worse. And so I wondered what had happened. And I realized what had happened was that the paper I was looking at was dated 2013. It was the final finished version of the study. But the witness was referring to a 2010 version. 3 years previously, it was half finished. It hadn't been peer reviewed or checked by anybody. And even after going through peer review, actually, it completely changed its findings. And so what this highlighted is how easy it is to cite any evidence that supports your viewpoint, even if it has been overturned. And this witness could not have been prosecuted for misinformation because it did cite the 2010 study, and there was truly a 2010 study claiming that low pay gaps are good. Even if it's been overturned by a separate paper, they were not making a miscite there. So what this highlights is that truth is not enough. So we live in a post-truth world, and we think now the solution is to check the facts. But just checking the facts is not enough, because even if something you quote is completely true, it could have been overturned by the same authors in a subsequent iteration of the paper, or by a completely independent set of authors in a separate study.
It's so complicated. And I think that that can be so overwhelming as a consumer of information who's trying to get a pulse on like what is really going on. And so I think this is the power of your book, is that you offer a real toolkit for assessing the information that we're surrounded by. And you start with some of the things that we need to know are happening internally, unconsciously. And I want to start by talking a little bit about confirmation bias, because this is a bias that is so pervasive and so invisible and exists inside of all humans. And I think even in the story that you're telling about you testifying, you know, the finding of the pay gap is not something like what we want is to believe that a smaller pay gap is better for companies, right? And so we want to believe something. There's motivated reasoning, there's preconceptions, and they all kind of color how we take in information. So can you tell us a little bit? Most people have heard of confirmation bias, but we do drastically underestimate how often it's driving our assessment of information in real time. So what do we need to understand about this omnipresent bias?
Yeah, so what is confirmation bias? It's the idea that we have a view of the world, and if we see something that confirms that view, we lap it up uncritically. And if we see something that contradicts that view, then we ignore it or try to shoot it down. And indeed, the witness before me was the Trade Unions Congress, maybe the equivalent of the AFL-CIO within the US. So they had a strong public position against pay gaps. And if you want to support a viewpoint, you can always rustle up some evidence that supports it. So when they found this study claiming that high pay gaps are bad, they probably didn't bother to see whether this study had been later corrected and overturned, or whether there was alternative research behind it. And notice it was not necessarily just the trade union which had a bias. The actual House of Commons may have had a bias, because they were concerned with the way that companies were run. And so that's why they launched the inquiry to begin with, because they thought that certain aspects of governance were broken and needed to be fixed. And what was rather harrowing about my story is that even though I told the Select Committee of the House of Commons about this error, that they had quoted evidence which had been overturned by the same authors, the final report of the study still referred to the tainted evidence as if it was gospel, and made a recommendation based on that evidence being true. And that recommendation ended up becoming law, which is mandatory reporting of these pay gaps based on the idea that they are informative about performance. So what this suggests is that confirmation bias is pervasive. It happens to all of us, including me. Even in the book, I go through examples of when I fell for evidence which was flimsy. So sometimes listeners might think, well, I'm statistically literate and sophisticated. Those biases are things that other people exhibit. No, everybody is biased. And actually, it might be even more prevalent among people at the top. Why? Because how you got to the top is you think you're successful, you don't need to listen to other people. And this can have devastating consequences. You could have Deepwater Horizon engineers thinking that the rig was safe when it wasn't. You can have the executives at Silicon Valley Bank thinking that their bank was safe, even though the models suggested otherwise. And so what this highlights is the importance of critical thinking, of trying to disprove our beliefs. So if there is some evidence that we want to be true, just to ask ourselves, well, has it been overturned? Let's look at whether the study was published. Let's look at whether there's studies by other people. And you mentioned, Yale, it's tricky to address misinformation. Well, I'd say it's actually not as tricky as we think. So the main difficulty is overcoming our own biases. But once we realize that we are biased and that we need to find different viewpoints and search for other information rather than just stopping at one viewpoint, that is easy. And it's even easier now with AI, which did not exist at the time of writing the book. For example, I just, during our conversation, put into Google, I'm not even using ChatGPT, I put into Google, link between CEO pay gaps and performance. Then it has the AI overview. And it says the link between CEO pay gaps and firm performance is complex. Well, some research suggests this, other researchers suggest that, and so on. And so you do get a much more nuanced picture than just latching onto one study that you like.
Absolutely. And I loved in your book that you admitted to being kind of duped by something that you read. And you talk about your reading of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and then finding evidence about how the 10,000 rule that so many of us have accepted is actually much more complex and not exactly a rule at all. I actually had a very similar experience with that exact topic, and similarly read Peak on Erickson's book, Peak, where he talks about critically Malcolm Gladwell's book. And it's so interesting how even folks in science are really susceptible. And as you say, like sometimes more knowledge can make you more susceptible. And that's kind of the power of the scientific method. And I think what your book does is it introduces the non-academic reader to like, how can we use what scientists apply in their work to prevent those biases from leading them astray in our everyday lives? And the tip that you have of, am I wanting this to be true? Could there be a different way to look at it? is so important. Another bias that you dig deep into is the all or nothing thinking bias, black or white thinking. And this is something that as a clinical psychologist, I talk a lot about in therapy, that we have a tendency to kind of drop into like all or nothing in our everyday lives. And so one of the takeaways that I took from your book is like when we encounter something that is quite simplistic about a complex phenomenon, to be pretty suspicious of it. And you give this great example of the Atkins diet. And I think there's so many examples that we can think of that are sort of in the news these days. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit to this idea of how appealing it is to have like more extreme conclusions told to us through news media, through story, and why we should be suspicious of it.
Absolutely. So what black and white thinking says is that even if you don't have a pre-existing view, we like to think that something is going to be either always good or always bad. We see the world in binary terms. And so this is the issue with the Atkins diet. So there's 3 main food groups, and 2 of them, there are probably pre-existing views. So protein, most people think is good. It builds muscle. People think it's bad because it's called fat because it makes you fat. But carbs are more neutral. They're not so clear-cut. But what the Atkins diet did was it played into black and white thinking by denigrating carbs as all bad. And what do I mean by all bad? I mean all as in terms of every type of carb. So refined sugar, complex carbs, they're all bad. And I also mean all by all levels of carb. It's not that carbs are good as long as they don't exceed 1/3 of your daily calories. All carbs are bad. Let's try to have as close to 0 as possible. And so why is that appealing? So it plays into our binary bias. It's also very easy to implement. So you only need to look at the carb label on a box of on some ingredients just to see whether to eat something or not. You don't need to ask, well, are these carbs complex carbs or refined sugar? I don't need to track my daily calories and see, am I at my 1/3 threshold? Let me just avoid carbs. But why is this dangerous? Because the reality is it's not that simple. It's not black and white. The world is nuanced. Some carbs are good, like complex carbs. Others are bad, like refined sugar. Carbs are actually good as long as they make up 35 to, I believe, 55% of your daily calories. And this is true with many other things. So with fats, there's obviously a difference between saturated fats. Even with something like cholesterol, which we always used to think was bad, there's high density and low density lipoprotein. And so when you see the world in a more complex term, this is not to make our life more complicated, but it actually frees us. It means that I can eat some carbs and not feel guilty because I can eat them up to 1/3 of my daily calories. It means that I can enjoy something with cholesterol as long as it's good cholesterol. So you might think that somebody who focuses on data and evidence and accuracy is a buzzkill, when actually we're not. We realize that some of the black and white rules that we often constrain ourselves with are not as backed up by evidence as we often like to think.
I think the problem with that, because I also think that people who think in complex ways should not be seen as buzzkills. But the problem is if you are somebody, for instance, who wants to lose weight, is that we're looking for the simple fix, right? And that hunger for the simple fix has really gotten psychology, psychological science, and social science more generally into a bit of hot water because there's such a pull for those simple if this, then that, right? We want to think in causal terms, but with humans, things are often not deterministic. They're far more complicated. And so I'm curious, what you think about the way that consumers might pull for those simple tips and what listeners who are also consumers might say to themselves when they find themselves kind of looking for that.
Well, certainly this comes from a good place that people want to have outcomes. They want to take things seriously. They might want to lose weight or get their children into college or be more effective at public speaking or whatever. But often simple solutions are not effective because of their simplicity. If it was just as easy as waking up at 5 a.m. every morning or just eating no carbs, then everybody will do it. So the challenge is that it's actually a huge myriad of things. It's pulling on the right levers and avoiding those which might be red herring. So there's certain things that we should be eating and certain things that we shouldn't. And even the things that we should be consuming, maybe we only want to consume them up to a point So what we want to do is what the science suggests. And in life, nearly everything is only good in moderation. We do have diminishing returns, even for things that sound good. We want people to work hard, but you can be a workaholic. We want people to exercise, but you can overtrain. We want people to diet and to show restraint, but you can obviously overdiet.
Yeah, I think that is so wise. And it's just something that I think humans have to continually remind themselves of, because life is so complex. So I think that we want something that feels simpler, like, just do this and then that will happen. But the reality is often so much more complex. And I wanted to mention like one more challenge and then talk through some of the tools. But one of the challenges that I think is so pervasive is that when something gets out, like the Atkins diet works, or there is a link between vaccines and autism, it's so hard to retract it. So even, for example, you talk about some of the replication crisis in psychology, even when findings are retracted or sort of added to in terms of telling, readers, this is actually more complicated than initial results showed, it's very hard for the more complicated message to get through. And I'm curious what you think about that, given that we are living in such a time of conspiracy theory. And like once something gets out, it's so hard to kind of get corrective information out there. And there's some studies and research that shows that the harder we try to get the corrective information out there, the more we get pushback.
Yeah, so with apologies for the rather crude analogy, how a friend described truth and misinformation is that misinformation is like urinating in a swimming pool. So once somebody's done it, you can't really undo it. It requires a lot of dilution, a lot of sort of the water to be recycled. And it takes a really long time to combat the initial spread of misinformation or the initial pollution. And this is because once something has got into the atmosphere, then people latch onto that. If it changes their beliefs, those beliefs are then stuck. And then it's very hard to unlearn them afterwards. So let's think about misinformation in a political situation. So when there was the referendum to leave the European Union in 2016, many people in the UK wanted to leave because of this claim that the EU membership cost the UK £350 million per week, which we could spend on the health service instead. And actually, that number was really false. It was about 100 million rather than 350 million once you take into account everything that the UK gets back from the EU. And so when it was found out that this was actually incorrect, and this was after the vote had happened, people said, well, I would have voted anyway for Brexit. Why? Because of cognitive dissonance. You don't want to admit to yourself that you were duped. You would say, well, actually, we voted this way for other reasons, even though this was actually one of the biggest pieces of evidence cited for why we should leave the European Union. It's something emotive. We could spend it on the health of sick people instead. And that might be the same for other issues, such as vaccination, as you mentioned. So there was a study published in The Lancet suggesting that vaccination is linked to autism by Wakefield, and that was later retracted. Despite it being retracted, it still is cited. You mentioned earlier the 10,000 hours rule by Malcolm Gladwell. That has been debunked left, right, and centre, including by Anders Ericsson, the author of the very paper that Malcolm Gladwell cites. But because this is filtering around in the atmosphere, it's become a folk wisdom. People don't actually realise it was false. And even if they do admit it's false, they say, well, actually, there was nothing really about that one 10,000 hours number. All Gladwell is saying is that practice is useful. So even if the actual content of what he said was not completely accurate, maybe the spirit of it was. So it is really hard to combat misinformation. And this is why I wanted to write about how these things actually matter. Just to get it roughly right is not good enough for some of these high stakes things that we're talking about, such as health, such as parenting, such as climate change.
Yeah. And I love that crude analogy of like, once there's urine in the pool, it's really hard to get it out. And so we do need to dilute it, and we have to be, persistent about doing so, because as you're saying, like there's policy implications, there's health implications to false data, false messaging getting out there. You talk about that even with solid data, we may still have lies. So I wonder if you can speak a bit to the difference between data and evidence in talking through the correlation between breastfeeding and IQ, which I think is such a great example.
So we often think if we have data behind it, that data must be accurate. We often like to use the phrase data-driven as proof that something is correct. But data is not enough. Why? Because data is not the same as evidence. So what does that mean? Because we often use those terms interchangeably. So where do we hear the word evidence most commonly? We often hear evidence in a criminal trial. So what is evidence? Evidence is only evidence if it supports one particular conclusion and it rules out alternative suspects. So if the evidence suggests that Tom or Dick or Harry could have killed Sarah, that is not evidence because it's consistent with multiple alternative explanations. So let's go to the breastfeeding example, which Emily Oster has covered in her work, and I also cover it in my book. So before I had my first child, we went to parenting classes. And these classes, in addition to really important things like how to change a nappy, they also had some modules on breastfeeding. And while much of this was on how to breastfeed, how to ensure a good latch, it started off with why breastfeed. And what it referred to was the World Health Organization guidance that babies should be exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months. And by exclusive, they mean exclusive, no water, no other fluids, and importantly, no formula. And so why? Well, this purported to be based on data. So if you take thousands of babies, you find that the ones who tend to be breastfed, they have better outcomes. This could be mental outcomes in terms of higher IQ. This could be physical outcomes in terms of better health. And it could be physical outcomes for the mother, recovery after a birth. And this is true irrespective of whether you look at American babies or Brazilian babies or European babies. It seemed to be something which was a truth universally acknowledged. But when you dig deeper, you find this is data, but not evidence. So why is it not evidence? Because there's multiple explanations for that result. One of them, which is the one that I latched onto myself, was that breastfeeding causes the higher IQ. Why? Because breast milk is natural. It's been something developed through evolution. It has to be better than the formula concocted by a giant corporation, just like synovial fluid, which greases our joints, that is several hundred times more lubricating than the world's best synthetic lubricant. But there's another explanation of this, which is that the babies who are breastfed are fundamentally different from those who are bottle fed. Why? Because breastfeeding is a choice. It's difficult to do, and it may well be that the women who were able to breastfeed are the ones with family support. So they might have a supportive partner, they might have a stable home environment. Why? Because it takes a lot of time to breastfeed a child. Sometimes the latch isn't good. It might just be easier to reach for the bottle. So maybe the women who are breastfeeding have a more supportive home environment, and it's that home environment which leads to the better outcomes for the baby and the mother, not the breast milk itself. So when you control for home environment, what that means is when you strip out the impact of the home environment on IQ or health outcomes, you find that the effect of breastfeeding is much, much smaller than people think. It's actually so small that it could be down to luck. And so I think the implications of this are pretty profound, because everybody tells you that breast is best. They even guilt trick mothers into thinking they're not a good mother if they're not exclusively breastfeeding their kids. One reader emailed me with a very emotive email, which she kindly said I could share with others anonymously. She burst into tears when reading this chapter. Why? Because she's about to give birth herself, and the hospital that she's at, which is linked to an Ivy League university in the US, tells her that because she is going to bottle feed, they will not support her at all. They only support breastfeeding because of the evidence. They're not going to tell her which formula to use or how often to prescribe this formula. Now, why is it that she's going to bottle feed her kid? Because she has no breasts, because she had breast cancer, she had a double mastectomy. So she had no option other than to bottle feed because of this double mastectomy, yet she had been put through so much shame for something which was not even a discretionary decision based on the apparent hard science. And then when she read my book and found that it was not hard science, she now realized that she's put all the shame for nothing. So these things matter. And this is why data and evidence matters, why it's not about being a buzzkill, but actually to give people more freedom. My wife and I still will breastfeed most of the time. So maybe for 80% of the time, we will use breast milk. There's many other advantages. It's bonding between the mother and the baby. But if my wife wants a break, then I can help out. And we can use the formula machine without guilt because the evidence is not as black and white as people think.
Yeah, I think it is so freeing. And I know that you are somebody who cares a lot about sustainability and climate science. And you're also a finance professor. And so sometimes if you're prioritizing one outcome, you might have to pull back for very good reason. So if you're only looking at like one pocket of data, like, is this profitable? And it's to the exclusion of, is this good for the environment? Then you might sort of get something that is data-driven and evidence-backed, but it's too narrow. Like, there are things that matter to us, and we need to kind of zoom out to be able to figure out, like, what's the balance of data versus personal values versus morality. And I think the way that you talk about the data, and certainly the way Emily Oster talks about it, it's just much more freeing, but it is more complex. There's not a simple answer. But as you're saying, like, we can see the beauty in that. That's a good thing.
Yes, I think just having this more skeptical approach to data, it's skeptical, it's not cynical, it's not being as conspiracy theorist, but it allows us to see the complex shades of gray, the nuance and beautiful colors in a world which might otherwise be portrayed as black and white. So again, it's to try to live more freely, to understand that there's lots of different trade-offs and lots of complexities. Let's take the example of climate. So often people say that climate is the world's most important challenge. We should completely defund fossil fuels in order to ensure that we are at net zero. And that's a really compelling narrative. And anybody who is to oppose that, you are seen as a climate change denier or just a hardline capitalist who only cares about money. But notice, even if you don't care about money, there are trade-offs. So in Africa, 600 million people have no access to electricity. And so what are the implications of that? Well, they are denied one of the key drivers behind economic and social development. Millions of people have to cope with charcoal and other very unclean facilities, which then lead to particulates going into the food, huge health hazards. Earlier this year, I believe, there was a hospital in Sierra Leone, which ran on solar power. There was a power cut and a baby died in the neonatal unit. These are things that we don't really fathom and we don't really appreciate being in the Western world, because we've always had access to electricity and there's always backup power sources. So we sometimes want to impose our beliefs on the rest of the world, not because we're bigoted and not because we are uncaring, but because we don't fully understand all of these nuances on the other side. So to understand there are people who live in energy poverty. There could be people even in the US or the UK who, yes, they can switch on the lights and so on, but the greater cost of renewable energy will be something that they would struggle with, whereas we can easily just shake it off and say, well, we need to pay this for a cooler planet. It's important to understand these complexities to make better solutions which bring the rest of the world with us, rather than us imposing our viewpoint on everybody else.
That's such a great articulation of a really large truth, which is that things are often more complex than we realize. Something that may seem like the obvious solution, but there's often more to it than meets the eye. So I specialize in relationship therapy and relationship science in close, intimate relationships. And this comes up all the time. So you're talking about like these huge world issues, and I focus more on like what's happening between two people. But often, for example, you know, one partner says to the other in an angry voice, like, how could you be so thoughtless? And the partner who's been told that, you know, gets defensive and says, oh, you're always looking for me to be wrong, or you're always angry. And like in both cases, there's often so much going on behind the scenes. There's a history, there's a lack of sleep, there's a feeling of being unappreciated, there's a fear of not being loved as much as we love. And part of couples therapy is helping people to do what you're talking about in a relational way of recognizing that we may have confirmation bias of like how we see our partner that, and thus we may be collecting data that just confirms, our fears. We may be thinking in all or nothing ways. There may be cognitive dissonance at play. And when you can sort of pull it back and get curious, what else is going on? What am I missing? What could be alternative explanations? You often find so much is happening that is just unavailable to you until you sort of do that exploration. And so you have this fascinating story in your book that I just thought was so fabulous. And I wonder if you can share the conflict that you had with an opposition lawyer during a lawsuit. And what happened when you reframed that conflict and got kind of curious about like what else was going on and what the fear was. And I also just wanted to say that you use this really cool tool that I'm very interested in a clinical way, which is a shared goal, identifying like we both want something that is similar. How can we sort of collaborate even though we don't see eye to eye? So I wonder if you can share that story and sort of what happened.
Absolutely. So I was an expert witness in a legal case for damages. And so one of my goals was to estimate the damages suffered by this apparent breach of contract. And so the two lawyers from both sides met to discuss the numbers, and they brought me along as an expert witness. Well, my side brought me along. And then at the start of the meeting, I was just shocked by how rude the lawyers were to each other. So they were just arguing and posturing, and then the client wasn't even there. So it's not that they were being deliberately aggressive to show the client that they were getting their money's worth. They were just trying to argue as much as possible. Your case is completely a non-starter. It's ridiculous and disgusting that you even are thinking you have a case to begin with. I said nothing. I was like silent for half an hour, and they were talking about me as if I wasn't there. They said, "Oh, you said that you would bring a forensic accountant here. This Alex Edmans person is a finance professor. He's not an accounting professor." I just said nothing. Finally, it turned to me, and they said, "Okay, now let's get to your numbers." And then I thought, well, one approach could be just to argue against the other person, just like the lawyer on my side had done so. But I said, well, let's take a different approach. I said, well, I understand why you have this meeting. This meeting is because you're unhappy with my analysis. Here are the three things that you're unhappy with. I believe that you think that the counterfactual of what would have happened if there was not that breach, this is misestimated. You think that I have overestimated the number of years of damages. And number three, you think that I've incorrectly used a wrong discount rate. Are these all of the things that you are unhappy with, or are there further things that you are unhappy with? Because my goal of this meeting is just to try to help you understand, even if you don't agree with what I've done. And the lawyer on the other side, the tone completely changed. Because rather than just arguing all the time, he thought, okay, well, maybe there is a shared goal here. And he said, yes, I'm unhappy with all of those things. And that is the extent of my unhappiness. There's not more than that. And so then I went through all of the three things and how I thought my analysis was actually reasonable on those grounds. And each time I would say, well, are you happy with this? Or do you have further questions? Are there other uncertainties? And this, I think, just changed the meeting, which otherwise would have been really combative, to something with shared goals. And at the end, I'm not going to claim I completely changed their viewpoint and they would agree with everything, but then the case settled with no further meetings because they realized that this analysis was not just fucked up with thin air. And I think this is something that we can apply more generally to other types of disagreements, because often we think that the reason why somebody disagrees with us is they have a different goal. So they must be our enemy, just like in a soccer match. We literally want to kick the ball into different goals. I want to kick the ball into your goal. You want to kick the ball into my goal. But could it actually be that we are on the same team? We have shared goals. So one aspect of my research is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there are some studies claiming that the more ethnic minorities you hire to a board of directors, the better the company performs. Now, I would love that to be true because I'm an ethnic minority myself. But I have highlighted that these papers are often flimsy, they're often correlation without causation. Now, somebody might immediately think, I have just bad motives. I have different goals. I might be a white supremacist and I'm just anti-DEI. But actually what I try to highlight is I have shared goals. I do want companies to be diverse and inclusive. But the reason why I'm opposing these studies is I want to make sure that DEI is based on correct science. Why these studies could be wrong is not because DEI is wrong, but because you cannot reduce somebody to just their ethnicity or just their gender and say, well, because you're a white male, you are non-diverse. Because that white male could have a background in humanities and everybody else's background is in science. That white male could have grown up in a different socioeconomic background or could have been in the Peace Corps and lived in different countries. And so what I'm saying is that, well, the reason why these studies are incorrect is not because I'm anti-DEI and I want to just completely oppose DEI. I want the same as you, which is a diverse, inclusive organization, but I want the world's best data to achieve this. And if indeed that this very reductive approach of looking at ethnicity is incorrect, that's not to say we should abandon DEI, but to look at broader, more holistic measures of a person's diversity.
And the ability to kind of land on a shared goal, even when your methodology differs or your agenda differs, can really bring together people from opposing sides and help to achieve better outcomes, right? Because you're working at things from lots of different angles. And what you're saying reminds me a lot of Danny Kahneman has this concept of adversarial collaborations, that when you bring two sides that are kind of interested in the same thing. In his case, there's like a couple of examples, but like say you have two people that have like different scientific theories of how working memory operates. Then if they collaborate on collecting data and trying to pit their hypotheses against each other, they'll arrive at a deeper, more complex, more comprehensive truth. And as you're saying, like the best data is much more likely to emerge when you have people who have those different views working together, even if they don't agree.
This is why, rather than seeing somebody as an adversary, think about this as somebody with a different viewpoint, somebody I can learn from. And ironically, this should be what diversity is about, which is about appreciating diverse viewpoints. And ironically, some of the strongest advocates of diversity actually shut off different viewpoints. They might say, diverse teams do better, period. Or I refuse to listen to bigots, when actually the other person might not be bigoted. They still want to have diverse organizations, but they are taking an objective look at the data. And again, this is something that we can all do, including myself. So for me, I subscribe to both the Telegraph and the Guardian, the most right-wing and left-wing of the major UK newspapers. And I read the articles. It's not just I subscribe them to tell everybody I subscribe to them. I seriously will read the articles carefully, including ones whose titles just make my blood boil a little bit. Why? Because even if 90% of what the article says I disagree with, maybe 10% is right, and I come away with it learning more than I had previously. And the reason why I want to do this is not just because I want to be open-minded. It's actually I want to be selfish. Because if I'm saying I'm a pro-sustainability person, I want to hear the views of the anti-sustainability people. Why? So that I'm not blindsided if I get questions in a podcast or after a conference presentation. So I learn much more by hearing people disagree with me than the people who agree.
I love that you do that. What I often try to do is like, I'll listen to a politician that I don't agree with and imagine if I did agree with him, what would I find appealing? What would I find compelling about the way that they're speaking or the arguments that they're making? But one of the things that comes up, and this is an idea that originally came from the renowned psychologist Carl Rogers, is that he talks about that one of the things that we really fear when we're trying to understand somebody deeply, somebody that we might not agree with, is we fear change. We fear that they might convince us. And you do mention that even disagreeable solutions might contain a grain of sense if we listen properly. But I think there's kind of two questions there. So one is, how do we find the grain of sense instead of just writing them off? But also, how do we handle that fear of maybe somebody that I see as having a really immoral orientation towards this topic that I find really important might have something to teach me, and that might move me away from what feels right?
I think it's a mindset. So just to come in with a mindset of trying to learn and recognizing that you might have blind spots, even if you're the CEO of an organization and you think that you know everything. So Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, highlighted the importance of listening with the intent to understand, not the intent to reply. And often when somebody disagrees with you, and maybe this is something that you advise them when you're doing couples counseling, is that you are not listening, you're immediately preparing your response in your head. And then as soon as they finish, then you just attack them on the other side. But actually, well, can we listen to see whether there's anything in this which is correct? Is there something that we can learn from? And then if the answer is change, then just say, well, change is learning. It's change is being better. And this is something I've encountered recently. It's something far less contentious than couples counseling, but I've always enjoyed working out and doing lots of really intense exercise, doing things like marathons and triathlons and now high rocks. And I've always thought, well, that the highest intensity stuff is really good. I've heard about zone 2 training, but I thought, well, yeah, that's useful if you're fatigued. But if I can do zone 5 training, then clearly something more intense is something is better than something less intense. And then it was through speaking to personal trainers at the gym that I recently joined who highlighted the importance of zone 2 training, even if you could do zone 5. Why? Because you're training a different system, one that burns fat rather than glycogen. And even though it seems really counterintuitive to me to walk up a treadmill at 3 miles per hour on a steep incline, when I know they'd be running much, much faster, I'm realizing, no, this is a different way of training that maybe I could have done it more effectively in the past. Going all out is not always the best thing, even if your body thinks it can handle it.
Yeah, everybody has something that they can teach you. And as you're saying, like, we can see that as like an opportunity to grow stronger in our minds, in our hearts, or in our bodies, as the case may be, rather than as something that is threatening. And it's really like a mindset shift to kind of open up to that opportunity to learn even from the people that we strongly disagree with.
And I think that was, I think, the biggest takeaway from the book that I'd like to leave the readers with is the learning mindset. And that might involve trying to see blind spots, trying to realize that people who disagree with you, they might have shared goals with you. They're not necessarily people to argue against, and they might have a different perspective on those shared goals. And I think if that's something which is taken more generally, it might lead to more civil and collaborative discourse than a lot of the polarization and point scoring that we see nowadays, where you get the most attention, not because your point is the most accurate, but because it contradicts the other side and it attacks the other side. And the more aggressive a post on social media, the more attention that it will get. And I think that is a bad state of the world to be.
I totally agree. And you offer this sort of 3-step solution to managing disputes that starts with like taming your gut response, finding common ground, and framing arguments around shared objectives. And I just think that that's a really powerful way to go about it, because you don't have to give up your view. It just becomes more of a collaborative effort. And I wonder if you can, so in addition to reading perspectives from lots of different angles to better inform yourself, but also to learn from people who you disagree with, I wonder if there's any other like main tip that you want to leave listeners with in terms of how they can be skeptical, but still pro-social.
I think it's to give other people the benefit of the doubt. So if somebody disagrees with me, then we impugn the worst possible motive. So if somebody says we actually shouldn't divest from fossil fuels, we think that's because they're a rampant capitalist who doesn't care about the planet. Well, actually, the solution is, well, we don't want to divest because we want to engage with the company. And if we have shares, then we have a seat at the table. So to give the other person the benefit of the doubt, I think that's the first thing towards listening to them. And then listening to them is the first thing towards learning from them. And then the more that we're willing to and able to learn from other people, the more that we ourselves learn. And then we come away from a conversation or from a potentially contentious dispute more informed and more enlightened than we started to be.
And more connected and collaborative. Like when it's a relationship, you want to be collaborating with your partner. But when it's like huge issues like climate change, we also need to be collaborating across the aisle, across differences of opinion. And so if we can sort of take that attitude, that mindset shift, and be collaborators, even with people who see things very differently from us, we're much more likely to be effective because we're working together as opposed to against each other.
Absolutely. And it means that whatever solutions we come up with, those are ones which are going to be more generally embraced and have a more realistic chance of succeeding than others which are going to be putting people into energy poverty.
Exactly. Well, I can't recommend your book, May Contain Lies, which, by the way, is such a fabulous title. I have been recommending it to everybody. I really encourage listeners to pick it up. It's terrific. And Alex, where else can people find out more about you and your work?
Thank you. So I'm active on LinkedIn under Edmans, Edmans. I try to post something every day, and often it's not my own research, but other things that I find interesting that other people have written about. I am also on X as Edmans, but I think I post more commonly on LinkedIn. Why? Because 280 characters, sometimes you can't always get the nuances into such a short post.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. We'll link to all of that in our show notes. And thank you so much for your time today. So appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.